What a great song by Patty Griffin. This just so echoed this sentiment of what the seeker is asking in Ecclesiastes. What are we doing this for? Is there a reason for this? And yet, in the midst of all that, the paradox is that in fact there does seem to be some purpose, some reason for going on, doesn't there? At some point we have to just say yes to life, and we do it anyway. But we recognize what it's like to suddenly have this sense of being disconnected, of finding ourselves wondering why. And if we're not careful, getting trapped in that circular sort of negative reasoning, negative questioning. So I put this picture on there, and I think we'll probably use this picture throughout the series. Some of you have seen this picture before. It's been around the internet for some time, but I love this image. I just love this image of this girl standing in front and the camel, both of them. I'm not sure if the camel started it or if the camel's responding to the girl, but I think it's wonderful just to see the two of them singing in a desert of all places. And this last week, I don't remember, I heard on NPR there was this wonderful story about the celebration of camels that was happening in the Middle East. And there was just this great sort of celebration as the camels were singing and the camel drivers were singing with them, and everyone was just celebrating this life. Of course, camels provide mobility and are so essential to life on the desert. And yet at the same time, there's this sense of life in the midst of the most simplistic, the most mundane, the most difficult sort of existence. Kind of, you want to talk about a hard scrabble existence there in the desert. So what is it that we seek out of life? What is it that we want out of life? We think about this word passion, and I think it's become trivial. If you think of passion has, there's a couple of different sources for the word passion. And I want you to keep in mind three words. I was going to get the board up here, and I forgot to put the board up here, but I want you to keep in mind three words throughout this morning, and maybe throughout this series too. But the three words are passion, passive, and path. And I want you to keep those words just in the back of your mind as I play around with them for a while and think about this text. Passion has roots that go back prior to the 12th century that are mostly associated with the Passion. We just celebrated the Passion. We just remembered the Passion. We remembered Christ's crucifixion, which is the most common understanding and association with that phrase prior to the 12th century and even throughout the church's history, even to this very day. Christ's suffering, Christ's crucifixion, the passion and the resurrection. And it has this root. It has this root that is suffering. So it seems to be logical that it would be associated with that. But does that make sense then to talk about finding your passion, right? So then somewhere around the 13th to 14th century, passion became associated with not suffering, it also became associated with sort of a sexual excitement, sort of a fervor for a more of a physical kind of excitement. And it became associated then just with passionate relationship or passionate engagement with others. So passion took on this sort of romantic quality to it that was because of the time that people began to play with that word again, but it took on that root. Not until, think about those of you who got your first job back in the 60s or maybe the 50s or even in the 70s. When did you first ever hear the phrase, find your passion? I remember my father-in-law telling me when I was talking about finding my passion before going into seminary, and my father-in-law was an engineer, and he was of German background and lived in German Texas. And I said, Marvin, he said, well, Tom, what are you going to do with your life, And I was like, well, Marvin, I'm kind of looking for what my passion is. And he says, that ought to be my daughter. Because we were engaged at the time, before I went to seminary. And he said, that's what passion is. It's your relationship with someone. But even that was a little bit obscure for him and for his generation, perhaps, growing up as he did in sort of central East Texas, and on a farm. This idea of passion, there's no real passion. Your passion is simply you got to do your work. There are things that need to get done. And so whenever I talk about finding my passion, he'd just look at me like I was an idiot, like I was in some kind of new age cult or something. What does this mean, find your passion? And Tony Robbins really was the one who sort of made the idea passionate. the idea of finding your passion, because we'd come into the 80s, which largely was this generation of sort of me, this generation of sort of finding myself and finding my purpose in the world. And we're back to Ecclesiastes asking these questions of why am I here? These kinds of questions were pretty remote to people who basically simply had to move from one day to the next to survive, to keep the farm alive, to keep the crops alive, to even in the factory. So this idea of passion as something we desire, it goes to something else, I think. What is it we really want out of life? Well, I think what we would, if we could nail it down, I want to suggest that what most of us want is a sense of aliveness, a sense of being vital, a sense of being alive in what we do, alive in how we live our life from moment to moment. But more than that, I think behind that idea of aliveness is this longing to be connected, that if we felt connected, we would feel alive. And yet we're living in the midst of a time where in reality we're becoming lonelier as a culture, as a world. I didn't know this, but did you know last month Theresa May, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, she appointed a minister of loneliness to Parliament. Did you know that? Had anybody read that? It's amazing. Yeah, I thought, what? A minister of loneliness. Because the epidemic of disconnection, of loneliness, of isolation, but even more than that, scientists are now beginning to realize that this idea of being disconnected, this idea of not feeling like we belong in spite of all of our connectivity, may be what is at the heart of some of our most pervasive divisiveness. Isn't that interesting? This disconnection we're experiencing, this separation, this sense of loneliness that we're experiencing as a culture in spite of our massive interconnectivity may in fact be at the heart of our deepest isolation, our deepest sense of divisiveness and isolation. And why is that? Well, if you think about it, scientists will show you that there's two different places in the brain where we experience connectivity, or we experience this sense of connection. Digital connection affects our linear part of our brain. It affects a logical part of our brain. It's like sitting down and reading a book. It's like reading a textbook. Because what's happening is you're filling your brain with information. Even when you're talking with somebody, you're filling your brain with information, but you're not really connecting. So that when you really connect, and that doesn't have to be with a person, it could be with a tree, it could be with a leaf, it could be with watching a scene, it could be with doing your dishes. But when we really connect with what we're doing, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute, but when we really connect with what we're doing, that's a different part of the brain. It's part of our experiential part of the brain. And when we connect there, we feel connected to something bigger than us. It's a big reason why we come to church, I think, is this sense to be connected, not simply to one another or to a part of a group, but to a sense of something larger than ourselves. I heard a lecture by Brené Brown recently, and one of the things that Brené Brown said in her lecture was that she spoke about, she was talking on Being with Krista Tippett. And one of the things that she said there in her new book, which I forget what it's now called. I want to say it's called Braving the Wilderness, but I think it's got brave in there, it's got wilderness in there. Google it and you'll find it. But one of the things that she says in there is that this is the great problem. This is the great crisis that we're facing, is this idea of not belonging. And she says you can see where it's being met, but it's being met in clubs, in groups, in communities that come together. She said it's a spiritual crisis, not a religious crisis, because that's where we have problems, right? When we get into a religious crisis, now we're dealing with what happens when we don't get it. We start looking for the other ways in which we try to find that connection by defining ourselves according to tribe, inauthentically, she would say. We're no longer trying to connect authentically, we're connecting out of fear. We're connecting out of what our neurological patterns are most comfortable with. Familiarity, negativity. I'll get back to that in a second. But when we do that, we're missing the connection. She said spirituality has to do with this longing to be a part of something that is bigger than us. Why so many people are rallying or jumping out into the streets and rallying about these different issues? There's this deep sense in which not only are we divided, but we need to be connected. We need to belong to something larger than ourselves. That's all that Christ was talking about. That's all that Jesus was talking about in his life. He lived a life that reminded people to be connected to one another authentically, alive. Now you say that that's sort of just a simple sort of thing to do. What's so religious or spiritual about that? But the reality is we spend most of our time building up walls because we are biological beings that are oriented more around our most primitive nature, which is survival and protecting ours or protecting mine. And so we tend to gravitate towards that instead of opening doors, as our old Methodist slogan used to say, open minds, open hearts, open doors, right? Well, there's still conferences that say that. Ours has kind of gone to the making disciples of Christ, which is a little more vague, and I think it could go that way, but sometimes I think it means making disciples of Christ who think like me, or who think like I think Christ should think. And so we have this struggle, right? Because it's not authentic connection. To have authentic connection means you have to risk being vulnerable, means you have to risk being open. That's the only way you get authentic connection. Anything else is simply connection by way of definition, by way of defining, and that becomes divisive again. It just builds into that. So this idea of passion, it's interesting to me that if you look at the root word, and you can go play with this on your own afterwards, but if you look at the root word of passive, it's the same as passion. The same root word is there. The same root word of moving through something enthusiastically. But of course, we know that passive means to be passively enthusiastic or passively engaged. Do you know what happens with passive engagement? More often than not, when we want to be passionate but we are passive, do you know what happens? We become passively aggressive. How many of you know what I'm talking about? How many of you either know people or you're going to raise your hand because you realize sometimes we're there too, right? Sometimes we get trapped in that same pattern of passive aggression. When you become passionate but you remain passive, you're no longer on the path. You are holding back. And when you hold back, what you become is you become aggressive. When you get depressed, what happens is you become aggressive outwardly or you become aggressive inwardly. When you get stressed, we become aggressive outwardly or inwardly. We become passive. In order to deal with this, in order to face passion, you have to participate in it. I was watching, I admit, I am an addict. I am a Matrix junkie, okay? And I apologize if you haven't watched The Matrix, but I am addicted. I just watched, The Matrix came on again this past week. I was watching it, and one of my favorite lines in the middle of The Matrix is when, okay, I don't want to go through and explain. How many of you don't know what The Matrix is? You know what it is, but you haven't seen it yet. Okay, you haven't seen the movie yet. All right, so I'll try to go through. I don't know if I can explain this in a quick moment. But the idea of the Matrix is that we are living in a sort of dream world. We are all actually plugged into machines, and that there is a digital sort of network of reality that we are living out of rather than real reality, that we are actually feeding the life of machines which now have taken over the world, okay? And that really sounds ridiculous when I start to say it that way. And you're going, Tom, why would you waste your time watching that? Well, you're right, it is kind of ridiculous in some ways, although we could get into all sorts of philosophical discussion. Go read a guy named Baudrillard, who was a French philosopher. who says that now we are no longer living in reality, we are living in a facsimile of reality, which is what we call reality TV, right? It's reality imitating reality, which is no longer real. Shut up. Okay, I understand. But this is what Neo, the guy who is basically unplugged from the machine by other human beings that are unplugged from the machine as they're trying to find a way to overthrow the machines and to really step into what reality is. They unplug him. They give him the blue pill. He's thinking, I should have taken the red pill, gone back to the machine. It's easier to live in bliss than it is to live with reality that I have to participate in making my life, in making the world better, right? But instead, he's taken the blue pill, so now he's stuck. And the worst part of it all is that they're telling Neo that he's the one, he's the savior, he's the one that's going to lead this whole revolution. But at one point, after denying it and after struggling with it, after one point of having lived through all of these efforts at sort of saving the moment, being kind of heroic in the moment, participating in making a difference in the moment, finally, Morpheus, the sort of sub-leader of this crowd, comes up to him and says, Neo, at some point you are going to realize that there is a difference between knowing the path and walking the path. Christianity is not about knowing the path. Christianity is not about holding on to the ideals of the path. The beloved community that Martin Luther King believed in and became so angry about what had happened to his I Have a Dream speech because it suddenly became idealized. It became ideological. And the beloved community, he would argue, is not about ideology. It is about walking the path. In everything you do, walking the path. Passion is about walking the path. And the challenge for us sometimes to overcome this sense of ennui and this sense of why am I here is to not get stuck in looking for the ideas. Eventually, where Ecclesiastes will take us is that it's no longer about getting stuck in the questions. It's now about walking the path. It's now about participating in creation. What does it mean to be alive, and how do we make life alive for one another is what it means to participate in our passion. And sometimes that does mean that we are finding connection with others, because we are participating in this life with others. And sometimes it means, as Brene Brown says, that we find connection in recognizing that we are part of a bigger reality, even when we have to stand alone to say it. Sometimes connection means being willing to stand alone to witness to aliveness where everyone else is trying to divide. So in our church, we have this struggle right now, and we have this struggle with what we do with homosexuality, right? And we have this commission, The Way Forward, which has made its decision, and it's given it to the bishops, and now the bishops are thinking about it, the Council of Bishops, and they're going to give it back to a special called council next February, a special called General Conference, where all of our delegates will meet for a special session and will vote on the options that are given before us. But already the troops are rallying. Already the Wesleyan Covenant Association on the right side is rallying to hold tight to what are the traditional values of the Methodist Church and the Wesleyan tradition. Already the left with the Reconciling Ministries Network on the left, already that group is rallying its troops and forces to stand bold against the right. And in the middle, Adam Hamilton out at Resurrection Church in Kansas, and our own Tim Brewster, and up at White's Chapel, all of these folks have already started to form what we call the middle way, which has always been the Methodist Church. The Methodist Church has always been about the unifying way. How do we live together? So there's a whole movement called the Unifying Methodist Church, which is basically who we've always been. Open arms, open heart, open mind. Think about what it was that brought you to the Methodist Church. If we surveyed everyone in here, we'd all have different opinions about any number of subjects. We realize that we make this path by walking it together. not by trying to define ourselves from one another or divide ourselves. It is going to be a challenge to see what happens. But I feel like our call, our passion, is to find connection in the midst of all this, to stand above the dividing lines and the walls. I want to end with one last thing about this idea of how we then do this, because I want to give you something to think of. Band, y'all can come on up here as I'm finishing up here. I listened to this podcast last week, and I was discussing with a group. I meet with a group of guys. Travis here meets with us, and some other folks in here, and then other people who don't go to church we meet, and we just sit around. It's all guys. I think we're going to open it up to girls eventually, maybe. I don't know. Right now, it's just guys, and we talk about God. It's kind of fun. We drink beer and talk about God. So, but it's really interesting. We talk about things that I think that challenge us. But more than that, I think we get to that place, and we felt it this past week, that as we start really talking about God in a way that's bigger than us, we start recognizing there's a level of vulnerability that starts to open up, right? Because now we're talking about where it is that it really touches us. And it's amazing when that happens. One of the things that we were listening to was Richard Rohr, the mystic and contemplative out of New Mexico, the Catholic of the Franciscan background. And one of the things that Richard Rohr talked about was he talked about how the negative patterns in our lives are easy, like I said, because it's part of our biology, right? So negative stuff sticks to us. Negative ideas, negative opinions, negative patterns, negative social network, it sticks to us. It's easy because it's part of our biology. Positive stuff actually doesn't stick with us. Think about how we've raised our children, or what people we've known who've raised children. The challenge that children have growing up in homes where there's a lot of negativity. When I worked in Clovis, New Mexico with a school out there, they realized the greatest problem in that school, it's a prison town. The greatest problem in that school was not that the kids were at risk or that they were devalued or that they were unimportant. The greatest risk was that they didn't feel like they belonged. They didn't feel like they had a place that wanted them because their own home was broken. So the whole community centered around creating community. What Martin Luther King would have in fact called the beloved community, so that everyone participated in that school. Family, non-family, everyone became family. The kingdom of God, connecting. And when they did that, and focused on the positive aspects intentionally, things changed, patterns changed, kids became motivated, found a purpose. So here's your challenge for this week as we begin to pursue this idea of passion, all right? What I want to encourage you to do this week, because I think we all do this, we all think negatively. We all get trapped in these little patterns. So I just want you to take 15 seconds a day, maybe 20 seconds a day, and look at something. If you look at the pile of dishes in your sink and you think, oh my God, there's those dishes again, go ahead and say, that's a negative thought. I'm just so used to doing that. And then let it go aside and look at it again. And this time, look for an interesting geometric design. Look for an interesting design on the plate. Just transform that moment for 15 seconds and take it in. Like Sharm was practicing with us, take in a deep breath and then let out a smile as you are grateful for what you just saw that you hadn't seen before. Like Mary Oliver saying, what are the instructions for life? Pay attention and be astonished, then tell about it. Walk around outside and for 15 seconds, promise yourself you'll stop and look at something, and rather than say that tulip's really pretty, you'll stop and look at the tulip actually. You'll take a deep breath and then you'll let out a sigh of gratitude. Just try it for 15 seconds, once a day, maybe even write down something about it. The way in which we change the patterns in our lives, the way in which we change the negative patterns, is by beginning to see the positive in life, by walking that path with one another. Amen.